Hi guys, my name is Shane Cuthbert. Welcome back again. In the last lesson, we learnt about, the reals and the feels, and we talked a little bit about separating them. So in this lesson, obviously, we're going to continue on. We're going to talk a bit more about that. I'm going to share with you guys a really good example of really how separating your feels and reals can be a good thing for you and can help you overcome some of your fears, some hurdles, some traumas, and can really get you in the right direction to really start attacking life, living your best life and living it to its full potential when you're able to do that, when you're able to separate those. So I'm really excited. Let's look at this example that I'm talking about. Every single person has different fears and phobias and things like that. And in this example, I really want you to understand just how unresolved, feelings and thoughts can really just create long-lasting problems for you in the future. So we really want to learn how to overcome those negative thoughts and negative feelings. So let's just say, for example, just imagine yourself having a fear of heights. Now, fear of heights is a common one. Lots of people don't like tall buildings. They don't like, ladders. They don't like being on roofs. They don't like being in planes. Okay, and the thing is, behind that fear of heights is really just a fear of not being in control. I mean, when you're up really, really high, anything can happen. If you're in a plane, it can quite possibly, fall out of the sky, or accidents happen. And I guess we're so used to living on the ground, we walked on it, we're attached to it all the time. When we take that step and, heights are involved, we really do start feeling uncomfortable because, we're not monkeys, we are people that walk on the ground. So let's say, for this example, you have an overwhelming fear of heights, okay? Now, you have an overwhelming fear of heights. You're walking through sort of a mountain trail. You're getting higher and higher up a mountain, and you come to a point where there's a bridge, there's a river crossing, okay? And all you have to do is cross this bridge. It doesn't necessarily matter how high this bridge is, and it doesn't necessarily matter how long this bridge is, okay? What really matters is how you feel about it. So you have a fear of heights, you're looking at this bridge and you're thinking, oh my God, I don't want to do that. That is terrifying. That is scary. So in your own mind, you're probably seeing it as being a lot higher and a lot longer than it actually is in reality, okay? And we've talked about that in previous lessons when we've looked at whether the glass is, half full or half empty. That's just a particular thought, and we've attached a feeling to that thought. So the feeling is obviously negative. We're feeling scared, we're feeling anxious, we're feeling vulnerable. So that's the feeling that we have attached to the thought. And the thought is, it's really high, it's really long, okay? It might not necessarily be that way. It might not necessarily be low and short either. It may just be as it is. But because we have an inability to see things as they are, we sort of make a mountain out of a molehill, so to speak, and things are, really, really blown up to be not what they are, okay? We make things a lot worse in our own minds than what they actually are. So you're scared of this bridge, you're thinking, whoa, it's so high, it's so far, and you're really starting to feel that anxiety sort of set in. Now, for those of us that are, learning to cross this bridge, it really is an exercise in learning how to separate the feels from the reals, okay? So by crossing this bridge, you're really going to have to learn how to separate the reals from the feels, and that is the reality of, the bridge, the height, the distance, is it safe or not? And how it feels, okay? So it might feel like it's unsafe. It might feel like it's really high up. It might feel really dangerous. To cross that bridge, we need to, learn how to separate the reals and the feels. So the bridge gets a lot scarier when you start taking those first steps, because you're looking down. This bridge is made a lot more scary, okay? Once you start walking along it, you'll notice that it's like a wire swinging bridge, okay? So it's not enclosed, okay? So it doesn't feel very safe. And you're looking through and you can see the river rapids, you can see down, and that's what actually makes it a lot scarier. When you start getting, closer and closer towards the halfway mark, you also start to feel the bridge, start to sway, and that swaying, just makes it even more terrifying for you. You start thinking, oh my God, I'm out in the middle here. It's starting to move. It's not solid. It's not safe. And that's what really, really starts freaking you out. So let's now in this example imagine that we have to cross this bridge, okay? And so we're trying to work ourselves up, to a point where we've got that confidence to do it. And we start we make a few attempts at it, okay? This is something that really, really terrifies us. We have a genuine fear of heights. And so we start doing a few different things. We take a few steps up the bridge, we get onto the bridge, and we try a few mental mind hacks to try and, overcome it. We start telling ourselves, little things that are, hopefully going to make us feel a little bit more positive about the situation. Really what we're trying to do is get the fear to go, okay? We're just trying to get that fear out of our mind any way that we can, any way that we know how. So a few things are going to help a little bit more than others, but it's going to take you a little bit of time before you finally come across the answer. As you're walking across this bridge, you're noticing every crack, in the bridge. You're noticing every bit of wear and tear. You're noticing that, the engineering wasn't so good in this part. You obviously notice that it's swinging. You might notice a few frayed edges. You might notice that there's a bit of rust. You start to notice all of the negative things about this bridge. So in your mind, you're thinking, how long ago was this bridge built? How long ago was this bridge constructed? Do the people that constructed this bridge know, what they were doing? Do the people that constructed the bridge even care about, what they were doing? Did they do a good job? How long, it's maintained? How long has this bridge been maintained? Is it maintained at all? Do the people that maintain it with care? If it were to collapse, will I be able to grab onto something? If the bridge gave way, and would I survive the fall? You start getting really, really, negative thoughts. You start thinking, oh my God, what if I don't survive the fall? Who's gonna look after my son? Who's gonna feed my dog? All of these thoughts just start flooding into your mind naturally as you're crossing that bridge with a fear of heights. When you step off the bridge, it makes perfect sense to you that the bridge is perfectly fine, okay? It looks structurally, it's a pretty serious bridge, okay? It's made out of steel and it looks really strong, it's sturdy. Obviously, you know that logically, okay, when you're off the bridge. So when you're off the bridge, you don't have those feelings and those negative thoughts taking control, okay? You can really just see it for what it is. You see, okay, this is a very safe, secure bridge. But you can't help that when you take that step onto that bridge, the feelings come in, oh my God, I don't know, and you start feeling that overwhelm that we talked about in the last lesson. Really what you're doing when you are acknowledging, and separating the reals from the feels is you're almost stepping outside of yourself, okay? Much like we did when we were looking at the glass being half full or half empty in the last lesson. In this lesson, you're sort of stepping outside of yourself and you're noticing all of those negative thoughts running through your mind. And you know that you're just getting, totally carried away with those thoughts. So you step outside of yourself and you challenge those thoughts. So in this moment, when you step outside of yourself and you start, challenging your own thoughts, you really start to zoom out and you start looking at those things that are, beyond our control and those things that are within our control. And you acknowledge that even if the bridge did, magically collapse, you've got no control over that. That's something that you can't control. If that's going to happen, it's going to happen. If it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen. You can't control that. It's like driving around every day. You can't control whether or not you're going to be in a car accident. You can control to a certain extent how well you drive and how safely you drive, and do you obey all of the road rules and that sort of thing. But you can't control other drivers. You can't control that whether or not another driver isn't going to hit you. That's just beyond your control. Yet we still get out and we drive, okay? And that's a natural, normal thing. And a lot of us don't even, put too much thought into it, okay? Not as many of us are scared of driving. There's still some people that are riddled with fear of driving for that reason. But for most of us, we've already learnt to separate the reals from the feels when it comes to getting behind the driver's seat. When you're standing out in the middle of the bridge, you realise that there's absolutely no benefit to thinking these negative thoughts. There's no benefit at all. You've already come halfway. Thinking about whether or not the bridge is going to collapse isn't going to help you get to the other side. And it's maybe, going to make you go back to the other side. If you're right in the middle of this bridge, that doesn't really make any sense, because you think, well, you've come halfway. Why not walk to the other side? Why would you come halfway and turn around and walk back? That doesn't make logical sense. But your feelings are what's overwhelming you. That's when you acknowledge that these thoughts are just your mind's way of overreacting, really, because of your feelings. So if you're able to then ignore the thoughts and you just, take a look at and observe the feelings that you're having, just acknowledge those for a moment. Just stop for a moment in the middle of the bridge and ask yourself, how does that feel? This is easier said than done, because when you put those thoughts aside and you just pay attention on the feelings, what you realize is that those feelings are actually quite intense. They're very uncomfortable. The only way you can really describe the feeling is that it's just a feeling of fear, a feeling really of vulnerability, that feeling of feeling very small and feeling unsafe. Feeling like a turtle, without a shell, or feeling like a baby abandoned, in the woods, and there's wolves in the woods. It's just a feeling of, being totally abandoned and unprotected and vulnerable. It's really just that feeling of being vulnerable, not having any control over that situation, not being able to control whether or not that bridge was safe or not. The thing is, that feeling has been there the whole time. You were just paying too much attention to the thoughts, trying to think things through logically. You were thinking, oh, what if this bridge breaks? What if this bridge does that? And you weren't paying attention to, the actual feelings. You weren't paying attention to how did that actually make you feel as you were, walking across that bridge. Those thoughts that were in your mind were driven, they were a direct result of those feelings inside. That vulnerable child inside of you, that was freaking out. Remember in, the previous lesson, and we've touched on this in a few sort of previous lessons, where more often than not, when, a baby is crying, people want to, give it a rattle, give it a distraction, or they want to give it a dummy and they just want it to shut up, they want it to stop, or they completely just hand it to someone else and make it somebody else's problem. This happens all too often, and that's really what we do to ourselves. In regards to our feelings, we just distract ourselves from them, or we avoid them, and we try to give them away rather than acknowledging that they're there, soothing them, saying, to ourselves that it's okay, this feeling will pass. Yes, we feel this way now, but, in about 30 seconds' time, we're going to be at the other side of the bridge and it's not going to feel like this forever. Our mind is really good at distracting us away from those unpleasant feelings. And our mind distracts us with all sorts of thoughts. We get so carried away with the thoughts that, reality just gets away from us rather than paying attention to the feelings that we're having. So let's look at an example in the classroom, okay? Let's look at, any teacher will tell you that, in the classroom there's always sort of one kid that sort of gets, he gets a bit carried away and causes distractions in the class. There's one kid in every class that gets labelled as being the naughty kid. The typical behavioural pattern of the naughty kid is that they usually just try to disrupt the class, okay? Distracting the class away from the lesson at hand. The teacher after a while starts to notice that child doesn't do this when they're feeling, particularly engaged. They don't disrupt the class when they're confident. They only ever do this, okay? This behavior only really comes out when they're feeling particularly vulnerable or they're not confident in what they're doing at the moment. If they can't understand what's going on in the classroom, they're feeling disempowered because they're not keeping on top of their learning, they start mucking up. And by mucking up, being able to play that role of the naughty kid in the classroom, distracting the teacher and the students and everybody else in that classroom away from what's being taught, okay, distracting them away from the learning. They do this because if they're naughty and if they're bad, at least there's some power to that. You have control over that. We have control over being, bad or naughty. We can't control whether or not, we know something or whether we're able to learn at something. So if we're, again, just like we're on the bridge and we start feeling very, very vulnerable, in class, the naughty kid's feeling, particularly vulnerable. He's thinking, I'm really struggling with learning this thing. Everybody else has no problems. Wow, I've really got no control over this. And the only thing that I can really do to try and take some of that control back is saying, hey, look at me, look over here. Look, I've got this paper airplane I'm throwing out the window. By distracting the class and by being naughty and by doing that, by causing that disruption, you're really, taking control and saying, okay, instead of looking over here at how I'm struggling and, I'm vulnerable, let's look over here. Look at this nice distraction. You're giving a rattle back to the baby, okay? You're putting a dummy in its mouth. You're using the pokies. You're putting money, you're spending money gambling. You're drinking alcohol. Okay, you're doing all of those distraction things. And I guess this is how it looks when we're younger, in class. This is a perfect example of having those distractions and acting that certain way, to get that result. That's exactly what's going on here. And, if you were a teacher, I'm sure you could relate and I'm sure you would understand this, as most teachers do. Just like everybody else distracts us away, from their vulnerabilities, okay? Just like the kid in class distracts you away from looking at his vulnerabilities and looking at his weaknesses, our mind too does the same thing with our feelings. It distracts us from acknowledging our feelings with all of these, other thoughts. Our mind and our body has a mechanism to distract us from those feelings with thoughts. And that cycle keeps going until we stop and we acknowledge that that's happening, like we did on the bridge, or until we stop and we acknowledge that, hey, that child's behavior in that classroom there, that's a reaction to some sort of vulnerable feeling, and really acknowledging that and seeing that for what it is. In those moments where you do acknowledge that and you observe that even in yourself or in somebody else, okay, so even if you see it in the child or that child is able to acknowledge that within himself, that's the moment where we want to start challenging our own thoughts. We want to think, hang on a second, what are those thoughts actually trying to cover up? Here's the vicious cycle. If we don't stop and challenge those negative thoughts, it becomes a vicious cycle, okay? If we look at the example of the child in class, if we continue to distract the class, that's going to rob that child of the opportunity to actually learn something. That child's not learning, they're going to fail to understand stuff, and that lack of understanding means that vulnerable feeling is going to keep popping in again, and every time it pops in, they start distracting the class again. It just keeps you going around and round in circles, okay? It keeps you stuck on that roundabout. It keeps you going around, following the same patterns, and never really being able to move forward and overcome those vulnerable feelings and acknowledge that they're there and move past them. When you're on that bridge and you're asking, those thoughts are popping into your head and you're asking yourself, am I safe? Is the bridge going to collapse? What would happen if I died? Now, if you allow, your mind to run away with those thoughts and the images that you're seeing in your mind, they're just going to make you feel more afraid. which is going to create a vicious cycle. You're never going to be able to cross that bridge. Fear will trigger the thoughts. The thoughts, after reacting to them, are going to make you feel worse, which only intensifies the fear, and that's how you get overwhelmed. You keep making this, more, frightening and scary than it needs to be. And you're doing that with your own thoughts and your own feelings. You're actually robbing yourself of the ability to cross that bridge. If you never take a moment to, step back and acknowledge those thoughts and those feelings and what they're doing and how they're operating, you're never going to be in control of your own life. These thoughts and feelings are really going to control you for the rest of your life. And if you want to change that life, it's really, really important that, we acknowledge this stuff so that we can actually start changing those thoughts and feelings. Because up until this point, our past thoughts and feelings have made us who we are. Okay, they've shaped our identity and our beliefs and our values. And if you're having a problem right now, it is because of those same exact thoughts. Those thoughts and feelings just distort our reality, such as by, getting us to believe that we are either all or nothing, that we can or we can't, that something's either good or bad, or it's got to be good guy versus bad guy. Without realizing it, we often grow up learning how to distract both ourselves and others away from vulnerable feelings. Our mind does this by creating thoughts which, despite seeming logical at the time, are really just our unconscious mind's way of trying to avoid looking at those underlying vulnerable feelings. If we get carried away with those thoughts, it can completely distort our perception of reality, make us feel even worse, and ends up just leading us around in circles. The key is to stop and step back from our thoughts with the intention to search for the vulnerable feelings hiding underneath.